The question of the EU target is quite interesting because after a period of being, let's say, quite heavily attacked by some, the United States, Canada, Australia, in the last decade, it's become clear that as a consequence of the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report, a number of countries have begun to revisit the question of should there be a global limit. And in the last months we've seen Chile, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa and Switzerland come out effectively saying this is the limit that they would like to see. South Africa is quite unusual, developing country coming out and saying this, but it results from a cabinet level assessment of the risks that they face. And I actually saw that assessment in draft back in July, August, and it's quite clear that they have a very good understanding that South Africa in particular faces very severe risks from warming even below 2 degrees. And that was the background for the Minister's statement that Malte showed. Least developed countries, smaller island states, actually more than half of the member states of the United Nations, have expressed the view that 2 degrees is maybe too hot for them, and are starting to push, let's say, more urgent positions. Now, I think Malte covered all of the pathway issues, so let me just leave you with one message, that in terms of the next round of negotiations, that the European Union's leadership in the next year is going to be really fundamental. I think the way that I've seen this regime evolve since it began really is that it's relied very much on leaders. The EU hasn't always been a leader. I glossed over some things here. For example, the legally binding character of the Kyoto Protocol is not an EU innovation. It was a proposal from the Clinton administration in 1996 that completely caught the EU by surprise, and they had to be locked in a council meeting for 12 hours before finally agreeing to it. But in the end, the EU has somehow owned that solution. But otherwise, the EU has been the major force pushing ahead diplomatically. And right now we're in the phase where the domestic measures that the EU adopts are going to be looked at very acutely by the rest of the world. Is the EU serious about meeting the kind of targets that it's talking about? In other words, of operationalising its ambition of limiting warming below 2 degrees. And that's why the discussions underway in Brussels this week are so actually vitally important, not just for EU policy, but for the overall aim of limiting warming below 2 degrees. So I'll leave it there with that more as a political message.
Thank you very much, Bill. On to the next speaker, I'm sure there are a lot of questions in your minds. Keep them there for another half an hour, and then we'll open all for this.
I'm going to complement what Bill and Malte have covered by focusing my talk on the IPCC role in this science policy interface around climate issues, also spending a little time to explain what the IPCC is and how it works. It was created 20 years ago. That's not the sound of my presentation, I mean. It was created 20 years ago by two parent organizations, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme, not to do research on climate change, but to assess the state of knowledge about climate change in all its dimensions, scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information, in order to advise policy makers and decision makers in general about these different dimensions of climate change. The mandate it has to assess scientific information on climate change and not to do research on climate change means that the assessments report published by IPCC are mostly based on peer-reviewed scientific literature about climate change. A very important part of the mandate of IPCC is that the IPCC reports have to be policy relevant, but they cannot be policy prescriptive. So there are people sometimes who say that the IPCC recommended this or advised this in terms, for example, of emission reductions, and strictly speaking, it is not correct. There's always, if the IPCC says that emission reductions are needed, it is always if preceded by an if. If you want to achieve this target, emission needs to be reduced in such a way. But the choice of the target, as Bill very clearly explained, is actually a policy choice that, of course, cannot be made by the IPCC. The IPCC is divided in 3 working groups and a task force. The first working group for the past 10 years has been, and that was so at the beginning as well, has been on the physical science basis part of the problem, so the climate system, understanding the physics, the chemistry of the system. The second working group deals with impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the third one deals with mitigation of climate change. That means basically everything that's related to the reduction of emissions. And then there's a task force on inventories, which advises the convention and the parties of the convention on the manner to inventorize the greenhouse gas emissions. I think Bill and Malte have covered some of this, but I think it's a complement. If you just look at the evolution over the past 20 years on the content of the Working Group 1 report, a key element that has evolved is the level of confidence in the attribution of climate change, of observed climate change, to human influence. In 1990, there wasn't something very clear. There was a broad overview of the climate science and a discussion of the uncertainties and the evidence for warming. But you have had to wait until 1995, the second assessment report, to find that sentence that was quoted millions of times. The balance of evidence suggests a discernible influence on global climate. You have to admit that this is a pretty weak statement, but it was, in a sense, very strong at the time. And 2 years before the Kyoto Protocol was finalized, and 95 was the year when the mandate to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Berlin at the beginning of 95. This sentence was extremely important because for the first time it said that climate change was not only something in the future, in climate projections, theoretical projection coming out of model, but for the first time it suggested that there was, even if the word perceptible, discernible is a bit weak, that there was already something to be seen in the observed climate evolution that suggested a human influence. So that was pretty important. Then 6 years later, you had something significantly stronger. Most of the warming of the past 50 years, said the IPCC, is likely, and likely means the probability is higher than 2/3, to be attributable to human activities. And then in the last report published last year, you had the same sentence basically but with just one more word, the adjective very before likely. And very likely means a 90% probability. So you see how over the past 20 years the level of confidence about the human activities role in the climate warming has increased in the IPCC report. Another important aspect of the evolution in the perspective that IPCC has had over the last 20 years is shown here. The first assessment report looked at, of course, the climate science and started to look at climate impacts, and on the mitigation side started to cover the efficiency aspect of things. And the second assessment report, of course, covered the same things, but added added consideration on equity issues. The third assessment report started to discuss, in addition to what had been discussed before, sustainable development issues. And then the last report, there was a much stronger focus, as I believe Malte and Bill have shown, on the regional focus. I mean, showing, for example, that Africa would be particularly impacted by climate change, or that the big mega delta areas would be particularly impacted, etc. But also focusing more, to the extent the literature allows that, on the cost of impacts and on the socio-economic impacts. What are the products delivered by IPCC? The main product category is the assessment report that I published every 5 or 6 years approximately. The first one in 1990, the last one last year, in 3 volumes typically, 1 volume per working group, 1,000 pages per volume typically, hopefully with a summary for policy makers. There are also special reports on particular issues, such as the special report on the ozone layer, on land use, aviation, technology transfer. There are methodology reports also dealing with inventories mostly. And then there are also technical papers of a more limited scope on very particular issues. For example, the last technical paper is about water, the relation between water and climate change. You can find all those reports on the IPCC website, at least for the reports of the last 10 years. How is a report written, and why does it take so much time? Well, first it's a plenary. A plenary is a meeting where 130, 150 countries are represented, so it's a meeting with 300, 400 people. Decides, after a lot of preparatory work, the table of content of each volume for each report. Then the Bureau of IPCC appoints the authors who are going to write the different chapters of each volume, and they start on the basis of the scientific literature to write a draft, and that draft is first subjected to an expert review. You have a few hundreds, or maybe a total of few thousand for the 3 volumes comments coming in on that draft, and each, and both Malte and Bill know very well about that, each comment has to be handled one by one, whether it comes from Greenpeace or Saudi Arabia or by the government of George Bush. They have to be attended and acted upon, one way or another. And the process is very rigorous. I mean, they cannot just delete a comment and forget about it, because each chapter of each volume has 1 or 2, sometimes 3, review editors whose job is to monitor the way the author teams are handling the comments. And it's their responsibility at the end of the process to confirm that each comment, and over the total AR4, the 4th assessment report, it's a total of, I don't remember the number, but I think it's between 10,000 and 20,000 comments total. I mean, it's a huge number of comments. has been handled properly. Then, of course, they produce a second draft. The second draft is subjected to a second round of review involving, in this case, not only the experts, but also the governments. In parallel, the summary for policymakers evolves, and at the end, you have a text that has gone through several cycles of review, and the summary for policymakers at the end is the subject of intense discussion and negotiations with the main authors of the report and the plenary. And the plenary approves, finally, this summary for policymakers and adopts the full report. Of course, excuse me. By definition, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to the rigor and the weight of this procedure. The advantage is that when the IPCC writes something, it is particularly solid because it has gone through all those filters. The disadvantage is that it takes 3 or 4 years to write a report. And also, inherently, and I think it's important to know, inherently, it means that by definition, by the definition of the process used, an IPCC report is a conservative view of the state of knowledge, because of all that filtering that came in the process. So you have to know that when you read the IPCC report, it's essentially, I mean, to a large extent, it's a conservative, a solid and conservative assessment of the state of knowledge. So this gives you an idea of the number of people involved, the number of scientists involved in the process, and it helps to understand how the IPCC as the strength it has acquired over the last 20 years, because thousands of experts are mobilized worldwide. There's an effort to have a regional balance in the author team and by definition also in the commenting stages. There are comments from everywhere in the world. So it means that the reports are not written by a small group of people in a few developed countries with a lot of scientific capacity. It is much broader than that. Since the table of content is defined by the plenary, and also because the plenary is involved in the summary for policymakers at the end, the reports are really close to the interests of policymakers, so they are policy relevant. The methodological reports are also widely used because the inventories, the manner in which the inventories for greenhouse gases are made, which is very important for the monitoring of the progress of the implementation of the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol, is made according to a methodology that has been defined by the Task Force on Inventories. Actually, those methodology reports are even thicker. They're about this size. I mean, the assessment report is about this thick, 3 volumes. But if you look at the methodology reports, it's about this size, it's even thicker. So those reports are widely used as well. Among the key points is the fact that it's in itself mostly based on peer-reviewed literatures as well. The fact that it involves both experts and governments increases the acceptability of the final products. And of course, there's a lot of media attention on the IPCC products, and it's not so hard to understand than why last year the IPCC shared, as an institution, as a group, it's not one person, it's an institution, a group of persons, shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore for the efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change, and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract such change, which in a sense shows that indeed as Bill has explained in a lot of details, the policy making that has taken place, particularly in Europe, but also internationally, over the past 20 years, has been fed through the IPCC by a lot of quality of information. Now, there's always a tension between science and policy. And this cartoon, which I'm going to show 2 times for some reason, was very clear in Kyoto, because on the one hand, you had in Kyoto very clearly the Article 2 of the Framework Convention as a background that was explained by the previous speakers, with that aim of the ultimate objective of the convention to stabilize the concentration. And if you are reading the different elements of the IPCC report, and you can you can actually read this article starting from the end. You can look at the impacts and the key vulnerabilities assessed by the IPCC report. You can translate those impacts for different temperature levels in terms of regional climate change, and then you can translate that using another part of the IPCC report in global temperature or radiative forcing, as Malte explained, and then ultimately you can translate that in emission pathways and in measures to be taken. I mean, all the information that you have in the 3,000 pages of each assessment volume actually could help you, if you were reading them reasonably, to conclude that very strict reduction measures would need to be taken, much stricter than what was done in Kyoto. But that's a little bit the theory. I think I'm not going to spend much time on these plots, but I just wanted to show 4 plots from the IPCC AR4, basically 1 for each volume, summarizing some of the key information coming out of these volumes. The first one, in a sense, summarizing in a very primitive way the first volume of IPCC, of the IPCC AR4, AR4 being the last assessment report, shows a relation between these scenarios, and it's very important to understand that these are non-mitigation scenarios. So these are not scenarios designed in order to protect climate. This is something that is not always reminded when these curves are shown. And you have here the translation, and you better look at these curves. Translation of each of those scenarios, and you see some of them have a shape similar to the shape discussed by Malte in his talk. Each of those scenarios has a range of temperature at the end of the 21st century. Why do you have a range? Because climate models have different climate sensitivity. The sensitivity of a climate model is a measure of the manner in which a climate model reacts to a given concentration. And some climate models react more to a given concentration than others. And you have, for each scenario, you have a range of temperature, and you also have a best estimate that's given. And that's the small square. So for this low scenario, it corresponds to this curve, non-mitigation scenario, you have a range of temperature going from 1.1 to 2.9 degree on top of the 1990 temperature by the end of the 21st century. And for the highest scenario, non-mitigation scenario, this one, you have a range that goes from 2.4 to 6.4 degrees C by the end of the 21st century. This range of numbers has been misrepresented in some reports after the IPCC plenary adopting this figure by just giving this range of numbers, just the best estimates. The best estimates go range from 1.8 to 4. But that's a very biased way of presenting the information, and it doesn't take into account the range of climate sensitivity that you have, and you better know the full range, that's 1.1 to 6.4. And it's also important that it's not a range of predictions, but it's a range of projections based on a range of scenarios. You cannot predict climate. You can only predict climate for a given scenario, but as you cannot predict on which scenario you will be, you cannot predict climate. And that's why IPCC uses the word projection. Then this plot has been shown. It's a nice summary of the Working Group 2 volume, so I'm not going to cover it again. This has been shown in another layout, but it's a summary, a biased summary, but important element of the third volume, showing the relation between the stabilization concentration and stabilization temperature, the peaking year for the CO2 emissions globally, and the range of emission reductions associated. And this is another important element, I believe, of the third volume of the IPCC in the last report, which shows that there are important possibilities to reduce emissions. This plot shows for 2030 the potential expressed in billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year of reduction in each of those sectors: energy supply, transport, buildings, industry, agriculture, forestry, waste. And you see that all regions have something to contribute. I mean, this color is for developing countries, this color is for industrialized countries, basically. It shows that all sectors have to contribute, can contribute. It shows that all regions can contribute. And it shows also something very important, that is, when the price of carbon increases, and that's the meaning of those numbers here, and when you go from left to right, you go from a price that's less than $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent to less than $100 per CO2 equivalent, per ton of CO2 equivalent, you have a potential that increases. And that's true for every domain. So it's only when the price of carbon increases is significant that people start to make changes. But if you add up all those contributions, you have very important reductions, which shows that it is possible to stabilize climate. Now, this was from the IPCC side, and if I show this a second time, is that because when you go on the policy side, and this I can go extremely quickly because it has been shown in another way by a previous speaker, I mean the relation between the first assessment report in 90 and the adoption of the Climate Convention in 92, the relation between the second assessment report 95 and 96 and the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol in 97, the third assessment report, which focused very much the attention on impacts of climate change and helped the adaptation subject to come higher on the agenda in climate negotiations. And of course, the last report is very important to create the context for the post-Kyoto discussions. Now, if you look at what was written about the IPCC report in some of the text adopted in Bali at the last climate conference, UN conference last December. I invite you to read while I drink. You might have the impression, reading the last paragraph in particular, that the IPCC report are going to be read extremely cautiously by all the policymakers and used very closely in their deliberations. And if you read this, you might even get this impression a little more, because it urges the text, and this is a decision by the Conference of the Parties, urges parties to the Convention to make use of the information contained in their discussions under all relevant agenda items, including those pertaining to the negotiations on future action on climate change. So you might think, okay, the IPCC numbers, and some of the numbers you have seen on this screen over the past are going to be quoted very visibly as the things to discuss. Well, if you look at the Bali action plan, you will see that it's written, for example, here, that deep cuts in global emissions will be required to achieve the ultimate of the convention, and that it's urgent, as indicated in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. But where are the numbers? Where are the numbers? Well, the numbers are hidden, actually. They are hidden very, very well. Because you have to look, to be very curious and to see what this note 1 means. And this footnote number 1 says, look at the technical summary of the third volume of IPCC, page 39 and 90, and also look at page 776 of chapter 13 of the third volume of the fourth assessment report. That's not very explicit, isn't it? Well, what is in the page? I can be very quick on this because we have seen this. This is page 39 of the technical summary. You have seen this table in another color. It's the same numbers. And you have seen these kind of plots in another format in Malte's code. On page 90, you have numbers about the need to, if you want, 4 low medium stabilization level to reduce emissions by these numbers for developed countries. And if you're curious enough to go to the page 776, you see a table that has been shown before, but which is hidden in those political texts. So there are, of course, there is, of course, a lot of recognition of the IPCC work in the policy arena, but there's still a lot of work to do. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. The film students can take notes of the lead lawyer's contribution to this ability to hide text information in the chunk of text. Now, in terms of the questions, I would propose that please very short. So I would prefer to have questions rather than remarks, or than very short remarks, so that we have time to go through as many as possible. So, anybody with any questions to speak for this?
For Mr. Meinshausen. I read that even if the human emission would stop now, temperature would raise of about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Anyway, do you agree? Is it true?
It comes from the year 2000 concentration stabilization.
I read this in an American newspaper, Los Angeles Times.
If you want just a brief answer, no, it's not true.
Okay.
Yeah. So, your statement refers to, as Jean-Pascal puts up here, to this scenario, which freezes current concentration levels, that leads to about 1.3, 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So here above this level, this is about 1.5, what you see. We wouldn't freeze concentrations if we stop all emissions today. Because if we stop all emissions, methane, for example, is not in the atmosphere anymore after 20, 30, 40 years. Nitrous oxide has a lifetime of 300 years, so that will decrease. With CO2, yes, there's going to be a part always, or for the next couple of thousand years in the atmosphere, roughly 20% something. But concentrations would decrease. So if we would stop emissions right now, what you see is, in the medium and long term, a significant decrease of concentrations back towards 370, 350, 300 if you wait long enough, multi-thousand years, and then back to pre-industrial levels. A side note to this, if you stop all emissions tomorrow, then we would see a brief warming spike, because we would as well reduce the emissions of aerosols, which are cooling the climate at the moment. And so there would be a very brief warming spike of a couple of years, maybe a decade, etc. But then temperatures would go down, concentrations would go down, etc.
Yes.
I mean, all those scientists that are working together on this report must be a lot appreciated, working on the causes, the effects, and monitoring those things. Don't you think there should be kind of a fourth working group focusing on technical solutions to fight global climate change? What can really be done to increase efficiency and so on and so on?
But that's the third working group. That's why I wanted to show this this plot showing the possible contribution of the different sectors, because that plot is actually based on studies about the changes that can be made either using particular techniques or using economic policies and other policies to encourage people to change behavior. And that's precisely the subject of the third working group. So it covers sector by sector all those possibilities. But I agree, the term mitigation is a bit obscure, and in French it's even worse. It's atténuation, which doesn't mean anything. Mitigation is actually the reduction of emissions, and the working group 3 deals with the technical and the socio-economic and the policy aspects.
My question is mainly to Malte Meinshausen, but the others showed similar numbers and may have given partial answers. In one of his last slides, he showed emission reduction for the developed countries. And if I remember well, these emission reductions were -25 to -40 for developed countries. And my question is, was this number assumed to be domestic reductions, or could this include CDM or other flexibility mechanisms?
We recently discussed it.
I mean, this is actually quite an interesting question. The table 13.7, from which these numbers come, is which is behind now, is actually an analysis of a dozen or more studies on emission allocation systems. So when you go to the underlying literature on every single study, then you see that they are about the allocation before trading, according to methods such as per capita convergence or multi-stage approach or south-north proposal for differentiating between countries. So at the beginning there are an allocation. 2 or 3 studies out of I think about 20 actually then compute the subsequent equilibrium result of each country, each region's emissions once trading occurs. But these numbers here are allocations, therefore they are before trading. You can have a discussion about what that really means, which is a valid discussion, because the non-Annex 1 country emissions are not capped, actually, but the models somehow assume that they are. So it's valid to then discuss, well, what does that really mean? But technically, they are allocations and not anything else.
This is sort of combining comments and questions. One of the things you mentioned in your talk was that you're waiting, or there's a credibility gap in the EU, and you're waiting to see, and the EU is playing this leadership role. However, the EU is only responsible now for about 14% of emissions, and it's shrinking. And what's more important, what the bigger factor is what's going to happen in the US elections. And the comment is, well, there's a smart way and a dumb way to go about emissions reduction. One is to look at the graphs that you've put up and show you know, it's already too late to actually do anything. We're already going to be hit by climate change effects. So we can reduce, and you have, within 10 or 15 years, we have to peak, right? But there's very little political will still in the US to actually do that, right? And that's one of the big players, about twice as much emissions as we have in Europe. And that's really more of an important thing to look at in the coming years, is what the US is going to do. Now, when do they get enough of a risk for hurricanes and other disasters which will hit the United States to have that sort of political will to overcome the immense cost this is going to have for people? And one of the solutions was to have the carbon tax, or to make people pay for carbon. And he said only when you have a price for carbon do people change their behavior. But the first part of their behavior they change is to start rioting, and we've already seen that in Brussels. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think the only reason you actually get these immense reductions that are necessary is when you have the political will, and that really comes not on nice graphs and really solid science, but on some serious effects. Do you see that coming, or are we going to do this the dumb way?
Well, it's somehow already obvious that we're doing it the dumb way. The question is whether we can get less dumb and do it smarter. And I think each big country in the world is going to find its own way of doing it dumb first. Remember that famous saying of Winston Churchill that you can rely on the Americans to do the right thing in the end, but it will be the last thing that they do, always to that effect. So, and there's every sign that they're going to explore all other options before coming to the right one. I think, though, it is somehow clear that political opinion is moving in the US, but it's also clear that even if it moved, and not optimistically, that the US political system will not agree reductions close to what the EU is prepared to do. And that's going to create economic and political issues in the EU. On the other hand, it's also clear that I think once the US political system starts to take climate change seriously, that there's a lot of potential there that could come quite cheaply in emission reductions. So in the US, it's not strictly true that the reductions are going to be as costly as you were implying. And already we're seeing major market movers investing in wind and solar and so on now at scale, so that actually the rate of installation of wind capacity in the US is accelerating quickly. And so solar installations, and that's not coming through market forces, that's coming through entrepreneurs seeing that there's a problem coming, and either unilaterally or because they see a potential market opportunity getting into investment. So in some ways the US political economy could be more dynamic than the European one in grappling with the problem once it starts to. The question of do we have to wait until there are severe impacts? Well, in some cases we clearly are waiting. In others, I think we're seeing that there is a gap emerging between what people are perceiving to be a serious problem and the way in which the political system is responding. I think in Europe that gap is less than in other places, but right now, I think Malte referred to the Australian situation. There is a very high level of public concern, but the political system is somehow moving very slowly. That's a gap that has to be broken down. In the US, you have a political system moving slowly and public opinion moving slowly. But I would anticipate that the rate things are changing in the world in response to climate change, that within a decade, nearly all political systems will be responding aggressively to this problem. Whether they choose the right solutions is another big question, of course, because some solutions are more expensive than others and more effective than others. And I think that's still an open question. For example, if the US adopts a domestic carbon trading system that is inconsistent with the EU or with the Kyoto Protocol, then that will make a global response much more difficult, because the US carbon price would be maybe a factor 5 or 10 lower than the rest. So we will then go through an uncomfortable process of trying to cope with that before finally the US system catches up. So I don't think there's any way out of a rather messy period now of trying to cobble together a gradually expanding carbon market globally, or at least a gradually expanding umbrella of carbon sources covered by a carbon price, until in 20 years' time perhaps we do have a more complete system. But the next 15 or 20 years are critical, and they're going to be messy and uncomfortable.
Very good. Please. Oh, sorry.
Add a few things. One thing, the IPCC report also contains a very interesting number related to that, and that is that if everybody was playing its role, and if there was a global carbon market, the cost to stabilize concentration at a low level would be less in 2030 and the same number in 2050 than a reduction in the annual growth rate of GDP of 0.12%. So less than 0.12%. And that's just looking at the mitigation cost, not taking into account the advantages of protecting climate. If you were doing that, it would probably be a positive number instead of a negative number. So it is not that costly to protect climate. Is one of the key messages coming out of the Working Group 3 report as well.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Marike Hare of European Hydrogen Association. It seems like things getting more messier with the financial crisis. I was wondering what the Working Group 3 is already maybe starting on this issue in reaction to what happened over the last year.
The Working Group 3 is actually now starting to prepare a special report on renewable energy, which in the long term will have probably very positive consequences on the climate handling situation. But the IPCC cannot react on a particular, on individual event. That's really not its role. But the comment one could make about the financial crisis, and that's also related to the previous question, is that when policymakers really meet a wall and an urgent obstacle, they suddenly find solutions and money that was not available before, apparently. So it may be that that we have to see and that's very unfortunate, but it may be that we have to see impacts that are much more severe than what we have seen up to now in particular countries to see more action. I mean, it's really sad that it is that way, but it's possible that's what is ultimately needed to have real action.
Put up the gun on your head and please all of us listen here. Yeah. Last final question. So,
Professor, I think that on this one, my name is Jean-Pascal, I'm a Kyoto Protocol consultant, and I think one of the things you might want to consider is the reason why all of a sudden there is a financial crisis right now. I mean, the money can be found, you stipulate. And I think what the financial sector or certain private groups of the financial sector have managed to do is shift the finding of this money onto all of the people back right here. So they have managed to find a trick and to push it into such an urgency that it's us taxpayers who are going to pay for this. So that's an easy way to find money. Now, one of the things that I would like to, that I request comments for, is actually the consideration of, that there is, during the hundreds of years, the power to print money has been shifting from going into the hands of governments to private groups, as it is right now. And I was wondering, imagine that you would see these CO2 certificates as money. I mean, everybody essentially who puts a wind turbine in his garden can ultimately apply for these CO2 certificates. So all of a sudden you find that the power of printing these CO2 certificates, money, into the hands of us, the people. So all of a sudden, imagine that these financial groups, for example, would have systems to bring all the money back or take it away from an economy, and all of a sudden then the people who are doing things can't find the money anymore to bring the goods from one place to another, for example. Well, now we have a backup system, because I would be asking you, well, I can't find any euros now to pay you, but you know these CO2 certificates, and I know that you also produce them with your wind turbine, and I'm producing them with my biogas installation, for example. Is it okay that I just pay you for now in the CO2 certificates, and later on, when eventually you want to, and this euro system or this dollar system would catch up again, we could eventually convert? Would that be okay for you? If you say yes to that, just as you say yes to this piece of paper, dollars and euros are okay to change goods, then we're just out of the crisis. And all of a sudden you shift all of power from the hands of that financial select group of families back to the people. I think that's maybe something that people would like to consider.
We're there.
I
can make an attempt. In University, economists were all three physicists.
Yes.
But actually, you have that already. I mean, to a certain extent, you have a carbon market. I mean, that's exactly what the Kyoto Protocol
has. That's, I think, the
produced.
reason why the crisis might be arising right now. Because all of a sudden, these groups see like, whoa, it's slipping out of our hands. Let's just dump everything and break up, and then we can buy all these interesting places to put wind turbines and everything. Who knows?
But I wouldn't overemphasize the importance of the existing first Kyoto Protocol club, and because it's only a select number of countries, only developed countries, and without the US. And also the value of the market is related to the size of the envelope you have, and the envelope has only been shrunk by 5% in 20 years. I mean, between 1990 and 2012, that's 22 years, and over those 22 years, those countries have to reduce their emissions by only 5%. So the value of that market is limited. But if we go for a larger number of countries involved and for stronger reductions, the value of that market is going to increase much more. And then we might be a little closer to your dream situation, but I'm not going to comment any further.
Very good. From science and facts to dreams in the end. That's a very elaborate progress and projection. Thank you very much to our three distinguished speakers. And I look forward to seeing you all here again next Wednesday. Thanks very much.